This is the UCLA Debate Union debating the question that this House would legalize prostitution.
Yes, I would now like to call upon the Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes and to open the case for his side.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're talking about the legalization of prostitution, but before we can talk about prostitution, ladies and gentlemen, we need to talk about sex. Because the idea of sex, even in today's society, the idea of sex as somehow being immoral, which is what the idea of prostitution, the idea of prostitution being illegal presupposes. This idea of sex as immoral emanates from old Christian ideals, frankly from European society. Ideas that sex is impure and sex will lead you to commit other egregious immoral acts, and sex will even lead you to hell. Mr. Speaker, this House we are defining as the United States of America's Congress. And in the United States of America, we are not a religious society, and we are not a Christian society, and sex is not an immoral action. We are not enticed to engage in sex by Satan or any other religious evil. Sex is not immoral, and that must be established at the beginning of this debate. As I said, this House we are going to define as the United States Congress, and prostitution we are going to define as the payment of money in exchange for any form of sexual favors. I want to now proceed into getting into my positive argumentation. I'm going to outline it in 3 main points. I am going to speak about the social benefits of the legalization of prostitution, and my partner will speak about the economic benefits. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by talking about the American ideal of freedom. Okay? The American ideal of freedom is such that when we choose to live in a society, we do so with the understanding that our freedoms are limited, but they're limited to the extent where my freedom to do something ends only when it harms someone else. But my choice to engage in prostitution does not harm other American citizens. It is a simple choice, just like me choosing to, for example, smoke marijuana or drink alcohol, if I were to choose to do so, would equally not harm other people, but really only harm myself, if anyone at all. And so in that case, we have to respect this idea of freedom, and people have the freedom to choose to engage in prostitution. It is not within the government's purview to prohibit it. Like I said, just like alcohol or marijuana, it harms nobody but the people who engage in it themselves, and it is not society's right to impose interdiction. My second point is that prostitution is going to happen whether we want it to or not. We see that now with the status quo. Prostitution is not legal. I think we all know that. That's why we're talking about legalization. But we're talking about legalization because it's such a frequent occurrence in our society. Right? Legalization of prostitution has a social benefit, though, because government can regulate it. In its current state, prostitution does not happen in a safe environment, and the people involved are often exposed and subject to terrible circumstances. If we legalize it, government can regulate the industry and protect the women involved. Prostitution can happen in safer places than it does now. Right now, prostitution might happen at some random trucks in some random rest stop off the highway in a bathroom with a trucker. Right? That doesn't exactly sound like a safe or clean environment for anyone involved. If we legalize it, we can have it in safer places, and we can more easily monitor the actions of the men involved, who sometimes are admittedly aggressive. And so the well-being of prostitutes can be legally protected and guaranteed. We can also, accordingly, eliminate pimps, eliminate this whole industry wherein women are almost forced into staying with it by aggressive and violent pimps. If we legalize it, we can much more easily control that, and if there are abuses, we can more easily prosecute it because it's much more transparent, and it would be more easily detected by the government. My third point, I'll get to your point after this. My third point is that legalization will accordingly reduce violent crime. There's no more room for violent men to abuse women because there's much more supervision by government, and it's much easier again for government to prosecute and to detect where abuses occur. So if those abuses occur, which they wouldn't to the same extent because this would be happening in safer places and in safer environments, those abuses, if they were to occur, would be more transparent and easier to prosecute. Did you still have a point?
Yes. Doesn't legalizing prostitution therefore promote a culture of objectifying women, contradictory to what you said about the safety of women?
I don't think prostitution is the reason we objectify women in this country. I think the reason we objectify women in this country is because of media and because of other sort of influences society has to deal with. But actually, I think, as I kind of already addressed, I think legalizing it will help women and will help women attain a higher order in society, which my partner will talk more about when we get to economic well-being. But if we can, if we legalize it, then women will be in safer environments. They won't be subjected to as much maltreatment from pimps and from the men involved in prostitution, and they won't be harmed to the same extent as they are now in the status quo. So again, to summarize, my first point was that people have the freedom to engage in prostitution just like they have the freedom to engage in anything else in the society, so long as their engagement does not harm other people. Prostitution does not harm a random man in the street, because if I were to choose to go have sex with a prostitute. The second point is that prostitution happens now in the status quo, whether we want it to or not, and right now it happens in unsafe circumstances where women are often harmed. So if we legalize it, we can guarantee the protection of those women involved. And the third point is that, emanating from that second point, violent crime will decrease, and because there will be no more room for violent men to engage in these kinds of abuses without being prosecuted by the government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge you to affirm.
Who in this team? Are you guys on off?
No, we're
You need to change it.
Wait, I need a pen. Do you found that?
Oh, you got it for you weren't taking POI. You got it for a pen.
No, I need a pen, yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
have a pen like that. Oh, stops it.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech. Now I would like to call upon the Bureau of Opposition to provide this case and for his side. Here, here.
Alright, the government has just given reasons why we should legalize prostitutions, and I will address them before I get into points of rebuttal. And he starts off by saying that sex is not bad. True, but buying sex is different from sex, the act itself, which I will address later in my rebuttals. And furthermore, he says that legalizing prostitution takes away the abuse that comes with prostitution, and we disagree with that. We do not see a correlation between abuse and sex. If I hit my girlfriend but don't have sex with her, I'm still going to hit her even if I don't have sex with her. And to get into our main points of contention, we think that legalizing prostitution is a gateway into objectification of women and people in general, not just women, people involved in prostitution. Because prostitution is essentially buying a sex act, right? And buying a sex act from prostitutes essentially makes prostitutes into commodities. And by making them into commodities, that's essentially a gateway into human trafficking and human slavery, right? And at that point it becomes, prostitution, legalizing it becomes a gateway into taking away human rights.
You had a point? Mr. Speaker, the op leader pointed out that there's, quote, no relationship between abuse and sex. But prostitution has a clear relationship with abuse and sex, wherein pimps verbally and physically abuse the women for whom they work.
And for that reason, we should not legalize prostitution, right? Because according to our government's argument that abuse related to prostitution would essentially increase. But I am talking about abuse that is not related to prostitution. I'm saying that abuse is not necessarily correlated to prostitution, and that is simply a generalization. So legalizing prostitution means saying it's okay to buy sex from a woman, right? That it's okay to commodify them as a tool for sex. And legalizing prostitution will increase sex, yes, but and it will give them essentially a job. But giving them a job in prostitution essentially detracts from actual jobs, right? By promoting that culture where prostitution is a legal job, you're essentially detracting from jobs in like science or the humanities, or jobs that take actual skill, right?
Shame.
Another point I would like to bring up is that legalizing prostitution means increasing sex and risk of risk of STDs, especially with rise in infidelity that would come with legalizing prostitution. Yes.
I'd like to point out that people who are going to be prostitutes are also not going to be saving us from cancer in the lab. So
I don't see how that relates to the debate, but so therefore there is also a public health issue with legalizing prostitution, right? That by promoting this culture of legal prostitution, you're essentially increasing the risk of STDs, and that poses a public health concern, especially with the rise in STDs and whatnot. So I've laid out some basic arguments that buying sex essentially makes women into products or tools for sex that makes them less than human, right? And that legalizing prostitution also increases risk of STDs, and that raises public health concerns. And for those reasons, I urge you to not legalize prostitution. But did you have some points of contention? Yes.
So you said the rise in infidelity and STDs will result with legalization, but legalization, Mr. Speaker, results in regulation, which could theoretically force men to use condoms and theoretically let prostitutes be screened for STDs regularly.
Forcing them to use condoms is essentially enforcing your will over them. So that's essentially the same way as that's essentially denying them human rights and their individual rights.
Hold on.
For all those reasons, I urge you to not legalize prostitution.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to come and give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes and close the case for his side. Hear, hear.
So, before I go on to support my opponent, or support my partner, sorry, and bring in my argument, I'd like to review some of the points made in the previous argument. I'll start from the end. Forcing people to use condoms is a violation of human rights. I don't see how promoting safety and the other point that you made that kind of supported it, my partner supported it. Bringing in screening programs violates human rights if it promotes safety and likewise promotes the well-being of prostitutes. I would also like to bring in the idea that prostitution is not just a career or job for women. Male prostitution also exists. And think a lot of the argument on the opponent side is that it objectifies women and belittles women and makes them more, I guess, prone to violent acts and inhumane discipline. Let's see. Okay, let me bring in one of my points. I'm going to talk about the economic benefits of legalizing prostitution. First thing that I'd like to bring about is the idea that prostitution already happens, like my partner has mentioned, and it happens via under-the-table payments and in completely illegal and black market conditions. The idea of legalizing prostitution will bring into the market more money and the potential of this money to be taxed and used towards those safety-promoting screening programs and condom distribution centers that these prostitutes, yeah, there you go. Prostitutes need to stay safe and have a career in this market. I'd also like to bring about the idea that, or I'd like to first let me refute the idea that prostitution isn't an actual job, and that we need to leave the people who want to do that on the wayside so that we can focus on science and medicine and the important jobs in society. I think by saying that, we're saying that people who want to choose to have this career are making the wrong choice. And I don't think that we can say that, because who is to say that someone who, from childhood wants to make hamburgers at a restaurant or make French fries at a restaurant is making the wrong choice? I think all jobs are respectable, and we can't say that one job in particular, even if it is selling your body parts in exchange for money, is an immoral or not actual job. Okay, another economic point with the taxes. I'd like to relate it to the market of cigarettes or alcohol. Cigarettes and alcohol. I guess my partner mentioned both of those. Cigarettes and alcohol have both, at one point in time, alcohol more than cigarettes, been illegal or widely considered even bad in today's standards. Alcohol went through a period where it was illegal, through prohibition. And now that it's legalized, it can be taxed, and that money can, for one, make companies very profitable. Some of the largest companies in the world are cigarette and alcohol distributors, manufacturers. And I think that this money staying in this black market, under the table market that is in right now, is kind of a waste to the economy when it can be used positively. I'd also like to bring about the point that this economic, I guess, stimulation could improve the well-being of people who would otherwise be in dangerous or illicit situations, like my partner brought up in a truck stop bathroom off I-40 in the middle of Arizona. We can, if it's legalized, we can. I mean, you could have it in the penthouse of the W in downtown LA, and it wouldn't be a problem. You could just bring her on up or bring him on up, and no one would say anything. Are there any points of refutation? Okay, I'll bring in some other things. Okay. So the point that prostitution objectifies women. I don't think we can say that prostitution objectifies women. One, like I said before, prostitution isn't necessarily a job only for women. And two, because objectifying women is, I don't think, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think we can blame society in general for objectifying women. I think that's something, yeah.
So would you say that in the status quo, the term of prostitution has that negative connotation where violence and sex is involved?
Address the judges, not him.
Sorry. So would you say that in the status quo, the
15.
term of prostitution, how come whatever question I asked, yeah. The term prostitution has a connotation in which violence and sex is combined.
I think any market and any act that is illegal has a connotation of being negative, but by legalizing it, we are getting rid of that connotation altogether. And for those reasons and reputations, I think you should favor our side.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give her speech not exceeding 7 minutes and closing the case for her side. Hear, hear.
I'll first be addressing some of the points that my partner has previously stated, and then be going over the government's 2 points of the social benefits and the economic benefits of prostitution. First, in the status quo, Judge, prostitution itself has a connotation of being combined with violence and sex. Now, the act of legalization in itself does not actually get rid of this connotation. At the point when this connotation is not rid of in the status quo and it's legalized, that basically gives the government's okay of giving such actions and allowing for such actions to happen. Especially when you look and see that there's actually no social benefits to legalizing prostitution, so the only benefit it has to the legalization of prostitution itself is only the economic benefit. Now, if the economic benefit is the only benefit and justification of the legalization of prostitution itself, we can clearly see that we are actually commodifying the lives of whether it's women or men, whoever is being within the Prostitution Act itself. Now, also, you're going to legalization is basically a gateway into the commodification of, as we said, not only women but other people. The act of being able to buy another person and their services and use them for sexual pleasure gives this act of the commodification of sexualization itself. Now, the act of commodification of sexualization leads to the commodification of other human beings, and that can justify things like slavery and different kinds of basically things that are subpar human and act of dehumanization. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, to assert that legalization of prostitution then would somehow lead to slavery is a ridiculous slippery slope fallacy.
It's actually not a slippery slope fallacy, because when you look to the justification behind it, slavery is actually very well enhanced because of the amount of money that could come off from slavery. Now, when you look to the government's justification for legalizing prostitution itself, the only benefits that they have are economic benefits. I'll get to you at the bottom of where I'm going. Now, again, let's look first at the social benefits that they have clearly stated. When you look to the 3 points that they've stated, they first stated that we can do this as long. The first statement that they've stated is we can do this as long as we do not harm anyone else's. We can do this because this is the American ideal of freedom, and as long as we don't harm anyone else, we can actually do this. Now, this is not an actual social benefit. This is my justification of being able to legalize prostitution, and so therefore no social benefits come out of the first sub-point. Looking at the second sub-point, they talk about whether prostitution will happen whether we like it or not. This is, again, not a social benefit of prostitution. It's just merely a justification of why prostitution should be legalized. Now, let's look at the third point. They talk about how legalization itself will actually decrease violent crimes. This is actually not true. When we look empirically, like drinking and driving is illegal. However, it still happens in the status quo, which means that crime will actually not go away once we legalize prostitution. Also, when marijuana was legalized, it was used even more, which means that it's possible that the use of prostitutes will be increased, which makes regulation extremely difficult than how they planned out in the status quo. Also, at the point when they don't even have a plan as to how they're going to regulate this, there's no way of efficiency when it comes to regulation itself. Yes, your question.
So if prostitution would make people be objects, can you point me towards another object who has the right to choose whether to be quote-unquote sold or not?
Sorry, could you rephrase your question?
Is there any other object that has the right to choose whether to be quote-unquote sold or not?
Is there any other object that
Yes,
has...
you say prostitution makes people objects.
Hold up.
Oh, am I supposed to answer that question?
If you don't.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't understand it. Okay, so the next point that they make is that prostitution can happen in like different truck stops in the status quo. However, this can actually be a personal sexual preference, and so therefore, even if prostitution is legalized, this can still happen after the legalization of prostitution. And so that means that they don't actually like help solve completely for these kinds of problems that they've outlined within the status quo in itself. And also, especially within the United States, the bedroom is not supposed to be regulated, which means that once prostitution becomes legalized, the regulation, they also do not have any mechanism to solve for any kind of regulation that can actually happen. They come up here and talk about grandiose plans of being able to regulate everything and be able to make this a market in which everything is safe and perfect. However, at the point when they don't even have a mechanism for regulation and where all of these flaws lie within their plan, that means that they have no mechanism of regulation itself. And so therefore, there's actually no social benefit coming out of the entire advantage one. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, this current speaker has deliberately misconstrued our second argument to favor her own, which is a straw man fallacy. She has said that we argue that prostitution will happen whether we want it to or not. That is not our argument. Our argument is that if it's going to happen, the government should regulate it.
Well, at the point when I'm telling you that there's no social benefit that comes out of it, even if it's going to happen whether we like it or not, so the government should regulate it, when they're not telling you any kinds of points of regulations that can actually happen, or when they're not telling you any social benefits that are coming out of it, there's actually no advantage to regulating it in itself, and so therefore there's still no social benefit that's coming out of the act of prostitution. Moving on to their second advantage of economic benefits. They state that the money can be taxed and used for different things. The first argument that I want to state is that these other things are never clearly specified. So therefore, you actually don't really know what this amount of tax is going to be used for. Also, this perfectly shows that the commodification is happening. They're justifying the legalization of prostitution in itself, which can have different kinds of repercussions, just because it has some minute economic benefit that can come out of the taxes. So for the reasons where there's actually no social benefit coming out of it, and the economic benefit actually further entrenches the commodification mindset that is spreading throughout society, that is happening within the status quo, that is happening through the prostitution in itself. That means that you're actually not going to be voting for the government team in today's resolution. This House would legalize prostitution. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for his speech. Now I'd like to open the back up and call the Member of Government to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes and open the case for his help. Hear, hear.
So let's begin by some refutations of the opposition's claims. They did a couple of claims that were sort of weak, and I'm going to explain to you why. First of all, they said that buying sex would equal to more STDs and to more trafficking. But this can be easily defeated by one point, which is, as the beginning government said, which was that it would lead prostitution, if it was legalized, would have more regulation, which would both decrease the number of STDs and human trafficking. So this is defeated. Another thing they said was, they said that prostitution has a bad connotation, so it wouldn't be good for society, but they didn't say why it has a bad connotation. As our first government said, that sex is not bad, so it doesn't have a bad connotation. And furthermore, they said that after marijuana was legalized, it led to more usage, so the same thing would happen in prostitution, but they said no data that would support this, and the two cases are not the same at all, so I don't see why these things would happen. Now, after I did these refutations of these claims, I can start off and move on to my argument. And there's 4 points really that say why prostitution should be legalized, and a couple of them were said in the first part, but it's really important to recap them as they're really important. And one of them is that there will be more taxable income. The second one would be that it would lead to more regulation and more safety. The third one is that it would let people choose. They deserve the freedom to choose. The fourth one is that people are already finding ways around this, around prostitution being illegal, so might as well make it legal and benefit. Now, why would prostitution bring in more taxable income? Well, prostitution is part of the black market, and as such, it's also one of the biggest industries in that market, and by taxing it, you would gain millions of billions and even maybe trillions of dollars. And all of this cannot possibly be bad, because trillions of dollars more of taxes would lead to more investment into different industries, and it could lead to more investment into education or any other industry which would promote society, because there would be more money that you can use in that. Now, before I move on to my second point, I want to take your point.
If there is an increase to technically trillions of dollars in taxes, doesn't this mean that the number of prostitution is actually increased as well?
To the judges.
Sorry. If the amount of taxes is increased to trillions.
Next time.
Okay. There's no known data to say how much the taxes would be, but it is very likely that it could be in the trillions. It could also be in the millions. It could also be in the billions. So it's just numbers that we're saying out there. But one thing is for certain: it would lead to more taxes. And more taxes would lead to benefits for society. Now, the second point was that legalizing prostitution would increase the regulation, and that would be better for everyone. Now, why is that? Because it would decrease pimps. It would increase the screening for STIs and STDs, which would decrease those numbers. And overall, it would lead to much better health. Now, the third point is that people should have the freedom to choose what they do, even if it's prostitution, which is a very fine job to do. Now, this country was based on the freedom to choose, and it should keep having those principles, because there hasn't been ever a case in history where people said, oh no, we have too many rights, take our rights away from us. People want more rights, and this would be more rights for them, which would lead to a happier population. Now, moving on to the final argument, which is that people are already finding ways around prostitution, around it being illegal, so we might as well make it legal and benefit from it. Now, one example would be the porn industry, right? What is porn? It's basically prostitution on camera. And if the opposition's claims that prostitution is amoral can be true, then what could possibly make it more amoral than filming it and showing it to everyone? Let's think about it. Now, if you have prostitution, it wouldn't be out there for everyone to see. Like, if you think that sex is so immoral, then you should delegalize porn and legalize prostitution, because porn is one click away for every 12-year-old, and it just makes the point. Whereas prostitution, it's not out on the internet, it's not as easily accessible, and as thus, it will be much harder to influence the population through it. Furthermore, it would expose this moral hypocrisy, so to say, so it would also lead to a more moral society. So, all of these points compound and really are much stronger than all of the opposition's points. And I want to just do a little recap and point out that all the arguments we have provided lead to more health, more money, more happiness, and more morality. Now, keeping all this in mind, how does legalizing prostitution not sound like the thing to do?
I
I'd like to thank the member of government for his speech, and I'd like to invite the member of opposition to give her speech, not exceeding 7 minutes, and opening a case for a half.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I state my arguments, I want to rebut some arguments made by the government. First of all, just before, the government mentions about the issue of porn. He said porn can be watched by so many people and has a larger influence, thus it should be legalized. But something is much more serious than porn is some of the videos like the ISIS burning the pilot alive. This can also see by a lot of people. Does that mean we can legalize burning people alive? No, definitely not. And second, the government also mentioned that after we legalize prostitution, we can make the society safer, can reduce the crime. However, we do not agree with it at all. I can mention some of the cases which happens, in the centuries of the prostitution. We think that the legalization of the prostitution is not reducing the crime, but just shift the crime from girls to prostitute. For example, in the last centuries in Britain, there is a very famous killer called Jack. He killed so many prostitutes. Yeah, but all the victims are prostitutes. And also in America last century, there's also several very famous killing which always targeting prostitutes. We just think that legalizing prostitution does not reduce the crime, but target the crime towards a group of people, and the victims is prostitutes. The issue I think the government part has is that it pays so much attention on economy issue. However, the nation has much more important things about morality. The government failed to point out the prostitution is mainly made by women or by men or even by she-males, I don't care. But if prostitution means this group of people, that means that men can prostitute, men can find women, so women can find men, even women can find she-males, I don't care. But do you think it's moral when you get married? We can think for this, if this one have become legalized, when you just back to your home and you ask your husband, you say, where you go? He said, I want to find a prostitute, or you say, I want to find a man or something. Do you think this one is moral? Yeah.
The opposition has still failed to say why it is amoral.
But if it is moral, will you accept it, or will lots of people accept it? We can have found very clearly that United States, there are some of the senators was dismissed just because of prostitution. We can, in this way, can be shown as a kind of, confirmation of an immoral. And also, I believe that, people will get, divorce or things like that if they found another part is this way. Yes.
So, first of all, senators were let off because it was illegal, and secondly, the divorce rate is already around 60%. How much worse can it get?
Okay, I'll just give you guys a kind of, if you are getting married and your wife is caught in prostitution, you may just ask her if she agree or not, and you just answer me these questions. So I'll bring out some of our argument. Our first argument is that the government part is mentioned about legalization of the prostitution as a kind of, because people, they have the freedom to find women or things like this, or they say that prostitutions, have something related with sex. So if prostitution have something related with sex, what's the difference with adultery, or I want to marry with more women? If we can legalize prostitution, why we cannot just legalize, we can marry more women? I think if I want to marry more women, it's also a kind of my personal freedom. And that should be legalized too. And also, adultery. We can also make it become things that is not immoral. Because I have the freedom, I love that women. So I don't think that you love a woman or you have a need for sex can be the reason of legalizing prostitution. And then the government part also mentioned things like about the tax, about the cash contribution. And we have, our argument is that, how many tax should we get from the prostitution industry? If you get so much tax, you can imagine, then the owner of the prostitute company or things like that will find, oh, this one is not profitable. Okay, they will just create a black market or prostitute without certification or things like that. But if you tax so little, I mean, make this kind of industry become profitable, of course, you will just treat, I mean, you just, attract so many guys pouring into such a kind of industry. And as what my partner mentioned before, it's a kind of wasting talented people or even just leading some people to pour into industry. I don't think that one benefits the country in the long run. And also the government part fails to tell us what's the legalized age of being a prostitute. And I think this one is also a very large issue because like 18 years old, 16 years old, 20 years old, different age people become prostitute will have different kinds of effect. And we can imagine, for example, if 18 years old students can become prostitution and they can get a lot of money. We know that nowadays, many of the college students, they have loan and they just go to become prostitutes and they can just get money. Do you think that is a very, rational or a very positive, kind of, impression? For example, Harvard students become a prostitute to get money, to earn money. Do you think that one is rational? I don't think so. And finally, we have just come to the issue of sex disease, as we mentioned, my partner mentioned. And the government always says we can force people to wear a condom, and I don't agree with it. A very good example is the example of Thailand, also the example of Burma, which this prostitution is legalized. In this country, they're known as the heaven of sex, and there's lots of guys who just have sex, but their AIDS rate is the highest in Asia. They are the highest one in Asia, and every year there's tons of people die from it. Finally, come to our point that we do not support such a kind of proposal of legalizing prostitution because we think, first of all, it has some immoral influence, and also, it will just cause much more negative influence. When we mention about Japan, think of it, we would think of adult video, AV. When we mention Netherlands, we would just think about abortion and also free prostitutes and young prostitutes. But if we legalized prostitution, what people will think of America would they mention? And that's all my point. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for her speech, and I'd like to call upon the government whip to close the case for his side and summarize the debate. Hear, hear.
5 minutes or 7 minutes?
7 minutes.
Oh, it's the one time I missed that.
7? 5?
Yeah, 7.
7. All right.
Good job.
Oh, boy.
Is it 7? I just sure.
Okay. Let me know when you get. Okay. I'll start my time now. So just to give you a quick roadmap of what I'm going to be going over, I'm going to try to summarize the debate, go over our main points, and compare them to the opposition's points. First of all, the opposition has this idea of this cycle leading to slavery from legalizing prostitution, which we addressed in the POI, but I want to go into it in a little more depth. It's just absolutely ridiculous because how is the choice to engage in such as prostitution going to lead to forced labor? If anything, illegalizing prostitution would lead to more sex trafficking and slavery because there's no regulation, and it's in your interest because there's no regulation to go around the law. Whereas if we do regulate and we have government watching the prostitution and we're able to facilitate how it happens, there would be really no need for human trafficking and thus slavery. So that whole point about how slavery is an outcome of prostitution really just doesn't make any sense, and if you think about it, it's just not even practical at all. So I'd like to go into the next issue, sort of morality and stigma. We right now sort of have this idea that that sex is immoral and bad, and the first government speaker brought it up in his very, very first sentence of his speech, is that one of the reasons why we sort of have this negative connotation of prostitution is because we, in a way, have this connotation that sex out of marriage is bad, which in a modern society such as the United States is completely not true, which is how we define this house. Also, who are we to decide how people want to live their lives? Does being a prostitute have any less merit than flipping burgers? I don't see why it does, because we think that sort of sex and using your body to make money is bad. That's the opposition's point, that using your body to make money is bad. If it's your choice, who are we to say that it's bad? My next point is that, hold on, let me just get to this point and I'll address your question. My next point is that there seems to be this false assumption that legalizing prostitution is going to lead to widespread increase in prostitution. And I just don't think this is true. The marijuana example was used, and that was sort of seen, that correlation doesn't really apply. Prostitution does not necessarily lead to infidelity, and as my partner already said, divorce rates are high. The prostitution is not going to lead to an increase in divorce rates. And if people want to choose to use prostitutes and do as we would define them, immoral things such as cheat on their wives, the government has no place to regulate us. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, this guy just mentioned that we can use this gentleman just mentioned we can use the body to get money.
Addressing the judges, that's proper.
Does it mean like we can also sell our blood and sell our liver, as some Asian country people do, to earn money? Does that mean better than prostitution?
Okay, I don't see any, if we want to sell our blood, if there's a demand for it, I don't see any issue with that. It is our body. We can inflict what we want on our body as long as it does not harm society. That goes back to the first contention of where freedom ends is when it starts to harm others and harm society. So next I want to go to how prostitution is already de facto legal. Essentially, as my partner said, it is legal to pay someone for sex and film it, but it is not legal to pay someone for sex. Now, this idea is just preposterous, and the fact that porn is not leading to this huge widespread of human trafficking and slavery proves that legalizing prostitution will not either, because it is essentially the same thing. And now I want to go into the economic argument, the tax regulation. The opposition said that we did not lay out a plan for where the taxes would be going for, but that's incorrect. The second speaker of the government actually said that these taxes would be going to safe sex practices, which I think would be beyond beneficial in just the legalizing prostitution realm, and I think can go beyond that realm into schools and areas which need more funding in regards to safe sex. They also said that we didn't have any way of regulation. They said that we had no regulation. Again, this is also false. The second speaker said that we would require medical documents and the use of condoms when having sex with a prostitute. Sorry. Now, the opposition said that violent crime would actually go up. And I think this is a misconception and is sort of having to do with the whole idea of prostitution being immorally wrong in our head. The reason that prostitution right now is associated with violence is because of the can I swear? Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah.
Because of the fucked up culture of pimps. And if it wasn't for that, this whole stigma wouldn't exist unless you are against sex, which I've already stated that in the first words of this debate, we're saying that sex isn't immoral, not in this society and not in this house. Do you have a question? Oh. Okay. Alright, so this, okay. I actually, they said that there's no social benefit, the opposition said that there's no social benefit of legalizing prostitution, and to that I say the social benefit is the freedom of choice, the freedom to do what you want. And although we may not see any tangible evidence of that, having more freedom does lead to a happier populace, as my partner said, and an overall better society. The government does not have the right to regulate our choices in what we do, whether it be to pay someone for sex. Now, again, that sounds That sounds very like immoral to us, but that, again, I covered why that's actually not immoral. For all these reasons that I've said, the misconception of the cycle, the whole the morality issue, which is false, and the economic benefits, I urge your vote for the government.
I thank the government whip for its speech proposing side government. I would like to now invite the opposition whip to close the case for her side and summarize the entire debate for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will be integrating my rebuttals in my speech. There are two issues in this debate: the benefits and versus the harm coming out of the legalization of prostitution, and then what's the implication on society and what. So under the first point, benefits versus harm coming out of the legalization of prostitution. First, we see points coming out from opening opposition that legalization will objectify the prostitutes, no matter they are women or men or what else. We see that when we are allowing people to buy a sex act as they are buying any other object and commodities, we are actually dehumanize these prostitutes, because they're selling their sex, the service of their body as any other objects. So, and in response to this, the government side raised the point about freedom of choice. We all understand that freedom of choice is not is limited, and the state has the mandate to interfere with the freedom of choice of individuals when it has negative externalities on societies. And the legalization of prostitution does have negative practical consequences on societies, which are coming up in my following points. Moving on to my second point in the benefits versus harm is the harm on families. We think that when prostitution becomes more accessible to people and it's legal and justified, more people, there will be a higher likelihood for people to get involved. So we think this will jeopardize marriage, jeopardize of harmony in the family, and as the government side has said, when the government is even providing avenues for these activities, it will become more widespread, and this will lead to more divorce. And we don't think that the current divorce rate is already being already high will be a reason to legalize prostitution. And moving on, there's important stakeholder in this debate. They are the teenagers. We think that when prostitution is more accessible and readily available, the teenagers will be prone to be influenced. Because if they are raised up in this environment, their values will be influenced and shaped in that way to think that prostitutions are okay, are acceptable. Moving on, the third point is, as my partner mentioned, more human trafficking. This will happen because when this industry becomes profitable and there's more demand for prostitutes, while there are less supply, less people willing to become prostitutes, there will be human trafficking to force people to be prostitutes and provide this service. And the government side raised up the point about regulation of the black market. We think that this is simply a problem-solution mismatch, because to combat the black market, the solution is not to legalize it, but to regulate the black market in whatever way it works the best. Because even if it's legalized, we think there will still be this black market, because people can charge lower price than the market price, and people can still have under-the-table payment so that they can evade the tax. So there will still be a black market. So we think that the correct solution is to focus on how to better regulate the black market itself, instead of just say, okay, now it's universally accessible of prostitution. So in the end of this benefits versus harm analysis, we see that there's no benefit coming out of legalization of prostitution, but there are a bunch of practical consequences on the society. So we think the status quo is far better. I will take from opening.
If we legalize and therefore regulate the market for prostitution, why would that encourage more human trafficking as opposed to less if there are legal ways for people to attain these services?
Yeah, well, the point is when you legalize it, it becomes justified, it becomes widely accessible, and if the industry turns out to be profitable, there will be higher demand for prostitutes than but fewer people willing to provide this, so there will be human trafficking. Moving on to my second main points, what's the message sent to society? So first of all, we think that when prostitutes become an occupation, there will be more people taking this job instead of other jobs. And there's this argument coming from opening that all jobs are respectable. We think as far as the values of society today remains relevant, this is not true. We don't value every occupation equally. In the status quo, under the value system of the current society, being a prostitute is not considered a decent job, and it's not further the intellectual development of the society in any case. So we think that when this becomes occupation, more people taking up this occupation, they will distract them from others, and this will slow down the development of society than if they take up jobs like scientists or engineers. And moving on, next point is that by legalizing it, we are sending a signal saying that prostitution is accessible, and we think that this influences the national identity of the nation. As my partner mentioned, the case about Japan and Netherlands, we think that for a country where prostitution is legalized and prevalent, people will, when people think about this country, the first thing coming up to their mind may be about the prostitution in this country instead of other intrinsic cultural virtue of that society. So we think that if most people in the society don't identify themselves with this value, it will influence their faith in the country and influence the cohesiveness of the society, because people don't identify themselves with this value. So, for all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for speech and closing the debate, and I'd like to invite all the houses and teams to cross
the floor and
shake hands.
And then exit the room.
And then exit the room.
So basically, nose game. Absolutely, I think we should record that. We can combine those two together.
Okay.
Wait outside?
Yeah, wait outside, guys. Leave.
Just go outside and stand. You don't need to take your bag or anything.
We have a right to use it.
For Keegan.
Usually let women go first. And Chair asks a couple of comments. Oh.
Yeah, the wings.
Actually, don't even know. How do you do it with that? Yeah, I don't think.
What? No. Yeah, here's what you do. Let me sit in here real quick.
Oh,
that's OGOO. Whatever. I would say this.
Yeah.
Now counts as very process. Found this to be very successful. Okay. Alright, so before we get started, I like to throw my wings first. I say, okay, room type, Steve, just give me your preliminary feelings on everything. I would go 1, 4, like in that order. No, you just tell me like OG1. Okay. Yeah. OG1, CO2, CG3004. No, the other word. You mean OG4? No. You start throwing letters in.
You do that right now.
Okay. OG1, CO2, CG3004. Yeah. Okay.
So, okay, no, I got it. Yeah, I got it.
Okay. You don't have to give me like a letter. You can say like opening up.
Opening up one for sure. And definitely forward opening up. So I think it's good. I don't screw the rest of the thing over. I'm gonna give the 2 closing up, just because I feel like they try to
give me your reasons. Okay. Which one numbers first?
3 is closing.
Okay.
I have opening up 1, closing up 2, closing up 3, opening up 4.
Okay. So pretty close there. So
Wait,
now
that's amazing.
Okay, so now you like I'm gonna back out of here right now. Okay, so this is how you want to start. So now you can kind of see that you don't need to discuss this position really, unless you have a view to discuss, like disagreement with them. Okay. Really, you don't have to discuss this one because this is all in agreement. So really, what you can focus on is the 2, 3, which is generally where it's going to happen. Sometimes you'll have a discussion about one, but of course, you're the chair. So what your feelings are matter more than your wings. But just a little. Okay, just a little. Like you don't want to completely just railroad them and be like, no, this is the way I feel. But if you have a feeling on it, like if you really don't think you should get 1, then you say, okay, let's talk about 2, 3, and then once you get that settled, then say, okay, I want to revisit this one real quick, and I want to give you some of the reasons that I have, and have a discussion or each consensus, okay? But this right here provides you with like a scorecard so that you can kind of say, where do we need to spend our time? Because you're only going to have 15 minutes if you're doing that. So if any of you guys are ever chaired, this format is ideal because it saves so much time. That being said, I'm going back out.
Yeah,
And you guys hear
let me
me?
say one more thing, which is, and you don't want to be a Nazi about it, you want to let them. I've seen chairs go, okay, here's the writing.
Yeah, no, that happened to
And
me.
that's really gross.
I got railroaded.
Yeah, railroad. And the other thing is, remember,
That's like
we
one
can outvote the chair if there's a real unanimous agreement. Okay, begin. Set the timer.
Why don't you give yours is?
Yeah, and then we'll
Yeah, because when the only feels my way, then I'll just give my reasons why I think it's okay.
Okay, so the 4 should definitely go down.
write yours, you just write yours.
Right, okay. So, 4 the opening opposition definitely.
Yeah, I think it's
The leader of opposition was not able to provide proper rebuttal.
And Diallo had no arguments.
Yellow had no argument, it was mostly a rebuttal speech.
Which, I mean, the rebuttals were fine.
The rebuttals were fine, there was no argument. There was one, no, sorry, there was only one argument that was coming from the entire side.
Why is there no space on that board? Because I think a lot of blade and then. Yeah, those are good.
No, but I thought some of the rebuttals were like.
So you get, right? So I'm thinking like, the reason I think. Because,
Yeah, listen, please.
Closing off was probably in her job for that entire round. She was not a team thing. The team as a whole is very brittle, and she also provided very little clash training.
Okay, you say that, right? But how do you say CG gave anything to the debate? He just summarized everything that the opening round was.
Yeah, but he gave the actual moments of clash. All she did was she brought up the main.
No, I'm talking about the number of them.
I know, but so I'm saying they're entire. Because he brought up the she's a clash, and they said that what she did was completely new information that we're not she's a clash, and just trying to.
Are you talking about the whip?
The whip. the member did really nothing about it.
No, the member over here did nothing about it.
Yeah.
The member over there, yeah, that one point about immoral.
You know, the member of government brought up 4 points.
Three of them.
Yeah, sure.
The one thing was.
The one thing is, no, it's not, it's false equivalence. But that's the point.
I think so too.
But no, but so he brought up at least 4 points, and he structured as arguments that he brought up as.
Why does that matter?
No, but what the member of opposition, the member of opposition did nothing, probably nobody would point on that.
No, the member of opposition. The member of opposition
That's not
brought up the
true.
whole age about the fact that Thailand has higher age rates than.
She also brought up the part that she brought up the really good point. That's what the social impacts are. Because teenagers can actually get affected by it. Because on both the government, they have the problem is as to how they will exactly ensure how that the government ensure that after legalization, even though that it's a legal market right now, how do they exactly make it? What is the legal age? What are the bases that they're using to do that? Because that's what I felt after. They didn't have a case. She just spewed out a bunch of things that she thought were false. That's my problem. Because opening government didn't have a case. No, opening gov did give a case. They don't start with one case. That's why I didn't feel it.
No, we're discussing between the two.
Oh, yeah. No, he gave one.
Yeah, we're discussing between the two.
Okay, so just how do I discuss three?
That's exactly what we're discussing.
No, I mean like his 3 and 2 have 2 different teams, not you.
No, it's we're discussing, okay, yeah, so.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's
He
good.
doesn't agree with the one. I discussed 3 and 2.
No, okay, we're discussing them versus them.
Right. Because the 1 and 2. Yeah.
The 1 and 2.
Because the 1 and 2.
Okay, wait, so we're gonna completely take Austin out of the 3. Like, we don't care about his.
Okay, because everyone else agreed on it, right?
Yeah.
So,
One and the two.
you're the only one that.
Okay, so why don't I do? So why do you think that they need to? Okay.
Yeah, why do you think they did? That's actually a
That's actually really
question.
yeah.
Yeah, because I just think that.
No, because okay, first, when it comes to the opening government, you see the Prime Minister, he gave out the right definitions. He said this house really well. However, even after that, even after you legalize prostitution, there has to be a demonstration. There has to be a bit more deeper plan for that. By just putting it out to the house that, okay, we legalize it. Fine, I mean, but so what? But it's, no, it is the onus of the government to tell you how to like this, because because it didn't turn into extra burden. It's not much looking into that. The thing is, they brought up the point. Teenagers, what about teenagers? What if they get affected? What is the legal age?
I didn't think about that. I'm not surprised by you wanting to make that argument. I didn't even think about that. That's a good point.
No, I know. But what that doesn't mean they got the last. No, I know, but they can't. I don't think that justifies them being taken down because it's not. They were the only ones that did build their job. If you look at total vote, and even the construction of their arguments.
The deputy prime minister was actually
that's the question. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's not about that.
No, sure. No, because well, yeah, the speaking wasn't great. Look,
It's about.
So this is what I'm saying. The Prime Minister comes out, gives you definitions that are good, right? Gives you says I'm going to be talking about he's talking about economics. Gives you areas, then that's it. The deputy prime minister comes in and says, here's rebuttals to both their arguments. Then goes on to talk about economics, like they said, they established 2 solid cases both times. He refuted. We haven't even moved this national structure. We go back to the example. They fulfilled their job. One side brought up valid points, the next one brought up more valid points, and in rebuttal. And they just did their job well. And they actually did the rest of the day. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, you got to be completely different.
Even at the first settings, he came up with it. So I'm going to talk like you're talking about how they structured it well. That's what they should win. I didn't say that. He came up and said, I'm going to talk about hand jobs, and my sex person talk about BDSM. And they went about structuring it well. I don't think that matters.
And I'm saying they had 2 new ones. His first new contention was that it already happened. It's not both in terms of payment. The second contention was the tax on where they're going to go. He had 2 new.
Yeah, I agree. We're arguing the same thing. We need to the arguments are good. I don't care about structure doesn't matter. The arguments are good.
The arguments are all agreed.
The 3 of us are agreeing on the arguments.
No, I agree.
Pratik's the only one who's not.
Even though they brought up the point on taxes, basically taxes, how are they going to ensure that all the taxes?
Yeah, okay, so.
Not
beyond the debate.
Like, they're gonna enforce it how they enforce all the things. The IRS is gonna be, like.
And again, okay, fine, like, do you think that means something?
The off-whip, which I thought was pneumatic.
Well, yeah.
No.
Or an entity, like, it was.
No, member brought it up slightly.
The member brought it up slightly, but I think that she was the only one who spoke about how it's still going to exist.
Yeah.
Even the lower prices, and I thought that was useful.
Let's remember all our positions, she said it's fine, analysis wasn't that great, but it's the output job further than. Yes, I agree.
No, it is the output job.
I know, output cannot bring up the context, so further the analysis, that's true. There wasn't, there was
Okay, I can see that. I can see that.
There's a lot of things, so that was my idea.
I think the member of Fox speech doesn't want them getting the one. Doesn't want them getting the one.
Okay, they brought up points. They brought up an extension. The opening opposition was just talking about how. I mean, no, I'm going to. The opening opposition was talking about the points about social consequences and how they're not going to be solved. Then they never talked about that. So no, not the author. Even the she brought up the points. I just don't think she did a good job. She basically just said them and gave a very she didn't really extend it. No, that's not she said she brought up the point. She brought up a bit of it.
It was very, very she comes up with this point about how if prostitution is legalized, why not polygamy? She tries to get at the slavery stuff, right? But she doesn't really do that properly. No, I don't think that her argument that was wrong and the whip was the last thing because it's something like expand on it. I don't think that's a very good debate at all.
I don't know if it's fair, but it's not a matter of fair. It's a matter of do you really think that they like look, fine, they technically faster. That's a different thing. When you buy them, maybe says there's no reasoning behind it. There's no actual logic. No,
So that was a rebuttal.
No. Oh,
She said in her argument that it was meant to be a rebuttal.
Okay, fine.
I think it's
so
fair.
the only issue that brings up is amoral and the legalized college. Their main argument is look at the statements of America. That's their main argument, right?
Also, guys, totally just right?
Yeah.
Because they're only not saying. Yeah, my rating stands.
Alright, cool. Thank you. Yeah. That never happened.
And then you guys get to do yours.
Alright, let it. No, we're not.
There, I agree. I'll buy it.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Thank you for the quick deliberation.
I will impart.
Okay, you're gonna do it speech by speech, right?
Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah, critique speech by speech.
If you could maybe break it with like summarize all of the like maybe yeah, so like time it like 2 minutes.
Guys, okay, you have a minute to say what minute, right?
So a minute for each person. I don't know.
No, not a minute per
30 seconds per person?
That's not the way.
No.
What?
4 minutes per person. That's a long.
Okay, so 45 seconds per us.
That's like 2 minutes. 2 minutes per person. 2 minutes. So just time it. You guys are jumping.
Okay. Start with opening. Start with opening government.
Opening government. Let's start with the Prime Minister here, okay? So we actually had really good signposting, which was like kind of new, and we didn't see much of that anywhere else. The one critique I did have was you said, like, we have 3 points, and then you brought up social and economic, and you made it kind of weird with your signposting, because you went up to 3 points to 2 points, then you went back to 3 points. So if you go, we have 3 contentions, the first being social benefits, second being whether or not society want it, third being equalization, then boom, move back on. Just makes it a lot clearer. Pretty good. You could vary your voice a little bit more just to draw us in, so like right before you get to an impact, kind of like slow it down, maybe drop your voice a little bit to draw us in, then hammer it back a little bit harder, and it'd be good just to like make impacts more valuable. That's pretty much.
Anybody else on opening up?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you had really confident speech, though, so that was good.
Okay.
Sorry, just something I wanted to say.
Project, please, for the can. This led leave it these far. Okay, thank you. Okay, go.
I thought the arguments were fair. I thought it was later pointed out that you don't really talk about very many social benefits, which I guess is kind of true. You do talk about how freedoms are, limited and like until they harm someone and stuff. But the reality is, and you didn't get called out on it in the whole debate. The fact is that even if you legalize prostitution, you could still harm prostitutes. That's what was jumping at me the minute you said freedoms are limited until they harm someone. It didn't get touched on in the debate, so I think that's totally fine. You get away with it. You also say that prostitution will happen with or without legislation, but that really isn't a reason to justify having it. Again, didn't get called down on it, but I think you later stated why you want it legalized, which I thought was fair. Other than that, I thought the other points were good. You talked about how legalization reduces violent crime. I thought that was a really good point. You did the split really well. You talked about what you were going to talk about, what the DPM's going to talk about. I think structure-wise, it was really good. Just a few of the points you were lucky you didn't get called out on.
Actually, something else to add that kind of applies to everyone in this debate. So basically, like, you gave like your point, and it was like a good point, but then you didn't really like give us the clear link of why. And that's actually something I do too. That like determines. So like when you say your point, then you say the ramification. Like, give us a step by step. Just really be clear. Like, just kind of over give the step by step, so you show exactly why like this leads to this.
Okay, now moving on to this, the leader of opposition, right? Okay, firstly, you hit your speech only 4 minutes and 58 seconds.
Can you move that glass, please? Thank you.
Right, okay. So that's the first thing to point out. It was a very short speech. Then, second thing, I think the way you were doing your rebuttals was a little bit, I think, at least for me, it was a little bit messy. Because the way you were doing your rebuttals is, okay, I'm going to say this, and then you just went on to your rebuttals. And we didn't know exactly what number of rebuttals, how many number of rebuttals you were giving. So next time when you give rebuttals, point it out. This is my first rebuttal. And this is my third rebuttal. So your signposting was a little weak on that. Even in your argumentation, it wasn't very well developed in terms of analysis. I mean, you had good points, such as how it can, lead to women. You said that women turning into tools, or women being again objectified, which is a good point, but it had to be further analyzed. I mean, probably we did not see that coming in your speech, and probably that's why your speech only was 5 minutes. Right. But otherwise, yeah, I mean.
So like one thing I noticed that was just really weird is you ended your speech and then you like accepted POIs.
Yeah.
And like I feel like at that point, if you just like already said thank you, just like sit down and don't accept more POIs. Like just like I know it's like it's gonna add some time, but either like I feel like just sit down when you're done saying things and don't accept it because it takes away from your credibility. And actually those POIs end up kind of hurting you because they kind of destroyed your case a little bit. And so yeah, I mean it was good and everything else, but that was if you end it, just like say end it.
Nothing else to add, I think.
Just 4 steps of reputation. They said, I disagree because, therefore, and signpost. His second argument was, I disagree because, therefore, don't legalize prostitution. See? Third argument was, I disagree because, therefore, don't legalize prostitution. Okay?
Oh, wait, just one more thing. You dismissed one of, I think it was Theodore's POI and said that it wasn't relevant to the debate. I wouldn't really use that, like, right from the, like, I mean, if it's really not relevant to the debate and you really don't think it's going to be relevant, then I guess that's fine. But his POI was that people who aren't, going to be prostitutes aren't going to be in the lab, like, coming up with cures for cancer either. And I think that's a fair point. I think that what he says is fair. I think a better reply would be that having legalized prostitution incentivizes people to go onto that career path and not onto other career paths that we would consider more progressive. And that really comes out in closing opposition. So I think they take that point away from you.
Also, I mean, I'd just like to add, there was this point, I mean, which carried on from opening to closing. There was rise in infidelity. I mean,
Just closing. No, that was just closing.
just closing because I saw that point in opening.
Yeah, it was open.
Yeah, it was opening. It was opening as well. Opening and closing carried on both of those points. I don't see how this point was, I mean, is really valid. I mean, correct me if I'm.
It was just closing. I did not hear the infidelity point.
No.
Briefly mentioned.
Okay, let's zip on. Okay.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you for finally bringing up that prostitutes are not just women and that they're men too.
Yeah.
And then that was also the thing. The whole objectification thing was way too focused on women. Like men can be objectified too. Good speech. Also the one thing I noticed was when you take POIs, you just like blatantly interrupt your thought. Like just blatantly cut yourself off. And like just you can make them stand up there for as long as you want. They're like you're giving them your time, so you can just make them wait until you're done as long as you want, then take it. And everything else is good. The selling body parts for money thing, you said like quote unquote, like you can sell their body parts for money. I know like the whip backed that up. Like you can't sell your liver for money, and you can't really sell that stuff because it's like really bad and it's illegal for suicide and stuff. So just like watch the way you put that. It's like selling your body in terms of like prostitution is not the same as legitimately selling your organs. And besides that, it was a good speech.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I had some really good refutations at the beginning, so that was pretty strong. But I thought that some of the arguments you brought up had already been brought up. But I would like to see some more like development in those arguments, kind of.
Maybe
Yeah, they were good points. And yeah, she's right when she says that you should analyze that more. But I think one of the main things is that when you do your rebuttals, finish them off. Don't go into an argument and then come back to a rebuttal. It just makes it seem like you weren't structured in the way you thought your timing was going to go.
So do all the rebuttals and then
all rebuttals and then all argument. That's what I would say. That's really the only criticism I think.
Okay. Actually, I have one thing. Just kind of tying up everything else. You signposted the arguments well, and I like that a lot. But you signposted your first point the same as the second signpost on his point. So yours was that it's already happened, so it's vulnerable. His was that it's going to happen whether we want it or not. So they're just like the same signposts, pretty much. Like, I mean, I get that they're different arguments. Maybe just change it because it sounds the same argument when you're just looking back at the flow, even though they are different.
Okay, now, the second speaker on side of it, the deputy leader of opposition. Okay, your speech was mainly a rebuttal speech. There was no second argument that was coming up from your side. I mean, once the leader of opposition brings up one point of, the deputy leader of opposition.
Andy, pointed at Andy.
Right, so when your leader of opposition brings up one point of argumentation, you're supposed to bring up a second point of argumentation, and we did not clearly see that. I mean, your rebuttals were really good, and you really tackled their points on that there are no social benefits of legalizing prostitution, or that there are no such economic benefits should not outweigh the social consequences, which we thought were really good points, but you cannot make your speech a completely a rebuttal speech, because that is one part of the deputy leader's duties, but you also have to bring a second line of argumentation, which was not present in your speech. So
some new matter.
Yeah, so you can be faulted for that, because you're expected to continue the line of argumentation and reaffirm the case from your side.
But I really liked your speaking style. I felt like you were like just speaking toward the judges, which is really good.
Sorry, three quick things. One, I like you brought up the idea of the no actual social benefits, just economic, and like that's like so true. So like I would have just like nailed that home a lot like stronger. They're like, look, they've said that they're social and economic, but there's nothing. All they're saying is they have money, but they've not shown any way that's actually good for the people. That was really good. Second thing is I like a lot how you changed like objectification when you realized that was kind of getting turned to commodification. So that worked a lot better for you. And that was like a really good turn because that really like saved your point, I thought, even though it kind of got lost later on. But the other thing I just asked about is like you don't need to say like I'll take it at the end of this point. That's like superfluous. Like you're giving me your time. Just let them stand up there until you're done, or wave them down.
Or learn to do this. Wave them down.
Yeah, like there's no point even like wasting your time if you're going to waste more of your time with them later.
Don't interrupt your speaking speech to say it to them.
I actually disagree with Austin on that. You call them out on having no social benefits and whatnot. I think that just because they label their argument social benefit does not mean that every point that comes under it has to actually be a social benefit. So just because, you know, some of his points, like about how, you know, you do it, you justify something as long as it doesn't harm someone, right? You give them these freedoms as long as they don't harm someone. You point out that that's not a social benefit. And while I agree with you, the fact is that he just stated it under his social benefit, like, tab. So I don't necessarily think that you have to call him out on that.
Right, so just to give a suggestion, I mean, you had really good points of rebuttals against it. You can combine these points of rebuttals and make that your argument about the social consequences. And you can just use that tagline, and rather than stating them specifically as rebuttals, you can combine them in your line of argumentation and actually use that to argue, rather than just making it points of rebuttals. And a small point, you took 3 POIs, I think, which, you took 3 POIs, which is... Three. Yeah, she took three. You took 3 POIs, which is not a good thing. I mean, you're not. I mean,
it's more than you need to.
Yeah, it's more than you need to. I mean,
2
the max you
is
should
enough.
take is 2. 1 at least, but max you should take is 2. So yeah, that's about it.
So on Member Gov.
Unless you need filler, but you probably wouldn't. I have just one other thing. Just turn your body around and address your POIs to the judge always. You have a habit of talking to the other team. They'll never change their mind.
Okay, so Member, one thing I just noticed right after you said you didn't show why there's a bad connotation. Like your prime minister actually said for his whole first 30 seconds why there's bad connotations. I don't know. I just thought kind of looked like it seemed a little bit like you weren't really paying attention, even if you were. It's just because you kind of directly contradicted them. You said increasing the trillions, which was yeah, it's a lot, but whatever. It's not really important. And the whole thing once again was that no links at all. You said all these 4 points. Oh, also you signposted 4 points. 3 of the 4 points were points from back then that you just re-signposted in a different order. And so I mean, you kind of did your job in bringing new points and supporting them, but you kind of just took credit for all 4 of them and put them in a different order, and it just made it even harder for me to carry through the flow. Because now there weren't points for them, points for you. Now it was points for them, then points for them and you that you re-signposted, and it got kind of weird with that. And you didn't have any links behind it. You just said for more regulation, you literally gave 10 seconds on that point, and that was it. And you moved on. And I was that could be a good point. Just flush it out a little bit more. But yeah, it was good besides that. You also touched on the moral hypocrisy at the end, which I feel could have been really strong, really good. Literally just and there's going to make a moral hypocrisy. And then that was it. And I was oh, that was such a strong point. We didn't get anything on a moral hypocrisy before that could be good, and then we just let it go completely. But yeah, I mean, it was good speaking style. I thought it was pretty good speech on your part. You actually spoke really well, so besides that was good.
I liked how you didn't stand behind the podium. I thought that was really good.
Yeah, I don't like the podium at all. And the more you can get out from behind it, you talk from a table, so you have fewer barriers between yourself and the audience, the better off you are.
Yeah, just going off of what they said, I think a lot of it's really true. I thought the porn point was really good. Porn is prostitution on camera, that's so true. It was a really good point. Except I think the one thing was that when you handled your POI, I thought the answer wasn't really necessarily, it didn't really do you much good. When Andy stands up and says, doesn't it lead to an increase in prostitution, I think the right answer there is so what, right? Because you're going off of what they said, and they say it's not immoral. So if she says it's going to lead to an increase in prostitution, your answer should be, it doesn't matter, we don't care. That's all I
Also, when you give POIs, maybe write them down, or just write them down to make sure they make sense. Because I get what you were saying, the one POI you gave to Andy about if all humans are objects, then which object judges. But that doesn't really work because not all humans are objects. You just think the prostitutes are objects. So I get why you didn't get that, and it just made it a whole confusing thing. So I think just write it down maybe first, so you have it spread out, make sure it makes sense perfectly. Say it concisely, sit down. If she doesn't get it, then that's just her fault. Sit down. Don't keep trying to explain yourself.
Yeah.
Also, a small point, you don't have to reiterate the points that have already come up from the front half, because by reiterating those points, you're actually giving credit to them. And you're actually telling the judges why they should win rather than why you should win. Because the point of the extension is to show what your backup thinks, and you have to provide a clear line of your argumentation. Because only that line of argumentation is going to make sure that you win or not. By reiterating their points, you're just telling the judges again, okay, if we've missed these points, then we can write them down and give credit to them rather than you. So, yeah, that's one part.
Yeah. It's tricky because you have to work with them and be consistent with them, but don't give them too much credit.
I felt like it wasn't very clear what I could expand more on that.
Okay, let's go on.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Let's go on to member of Bob. Do you guys have anything? Okay. Yeah, it was like pretty good. You brought up a lot of points. Once again, like you touched on a lot of things, but like there wasn't like you had a lot of things in the whole immorality of it. Of like, well, now we're gonna have a lot of adultery and like when do we have polygamy or not, which is like a slippery slope in that itself. That doesn't really work. But like, I
thought that was good.
I thought your point about the age that you weren't sure, like,
that was good.
Yeah, I thought that was a really strong point, and you should have continued talking about that even more. But when you talked about the students, like how students was it you who talked about the students? That students, yeah, I thought that was really good. I thought that showed like a actual reason, like a negative thing that would happen if you legalize prostitution.
Yeah, I just thought maybe more like pulling it all together because like you kind of jumped around between different the amorality stuff. So you just like amorality, then all these different things, spend like a good like 3-4 minutes on the amorality of it. Then like I really like when I'm flowing, I know, ooh, look at all this amoral stuff that we're having behind it, and that'll like be really good because it is a good point. It's a big point that wasn't brought up before.
That's actually a knife, though. I think to go out and say that's immoral was a knife because you're